Well, hello everyone, and I hope you're keeping healthy and well in the pandemic. And this is my Life in the Universe pandemic series, and it's a set of short talks about things to do with life in the universe and in all of its wonderful and wide variety. And today, instead of talking about a particular scientific question, what I thought I would do is talk about this question: how do I become an astrobiologist? Now, this is an interesting question, and as a professor of astrobiology, I get asked this quite a lot. I get quite a lot of emails from people saying, how do I become an astrobiologist? How do I take an interest in astrobiology? So today, what I thought I'd do is talk about that question a bit, and hopefully perhaps give some useful information. Now, I should say that my view on this is just my view. I don't want to be responsible for derailing people's whole careers. So if you are interested in becoming an astrobiologist, do go out and ask other people as well. My particular point of view is just one perspective, but I hope that with the experiences I have, maybe I can provide at least some useful ideas. I should also say that some of you might have been sent here by my future self, who perhaps has emailed you and said, watch this video about how to become an astrobiologist. So I'm really sorry if you've not received a full-length email explaining how to become an astrobiologist. My future self is a little bit lazy and he sent you back into the past to watch this video. But hopefully this will answer the question that you asked in your email. So the first thing that's worth pointing out is that astrobiology is a very, very broad field. In fact, I'll be the first to say it's so broad that in some sense the term is a little bit useless, simply because it covers life in the universe, and everything. In that sense, it's rather unconstrained. That's in fact what makes it such an exciting, interesting and diverse field to work in. But it does mean it's a little bit difficult to define what an astrobiologist is when people ask that question. Very few people in astrobiology are truly trained as astrobiologists. Most of us are trained in one particular science. So, for example, you might find an astrophysicist who is looking for exoplanets, and maybe they have some knowledge of biology, and that's brought them into astrobiology to search for biosignatures of life on distant planets. But fundamentally, they're trained as an astrophysicist. You might find a biologist who has a background in biology and is thinking about the origin of life, for example, and is getting into questions about the chemistry of the origin of life and what were those first chemical reactions, but they're basically trained as a biologist. It might be worth giving you some knowledge of my own background. This is just one particular career, and I'm not going to spend my time telling you my life story, which I'm sure you have absolutely no interest in at all, but just as an example of someone who carried on through a career in science and became an astrobiologist. Perhaps this is a useful benchmark to help you think about the sorts of steps that you might take. I did my first degree in biochemistry at the University of Bristol, so I'm basically trained as a biochemist. Astrobiology didn't exist then, or at least it certainly didn't exist as a subject that you could do seriously, so there was no possibility for me to go on and do a doctorate, a PhD in astrobiology. They just didn't exist at that time. So I did a PhD in molecular biophysics, where I studied blood clotting proteins. So it was medical molecular biology, about as far away from astrobiology as you could be, but I still had a fascination for space. In fact, an interest in space exploration from a very young age. So during that PhD, I attended the International Space University, which was a 10-week summer course to learn everything to do with space exploration that fascinated me so much. And it was there that I met people from NASA, and then spent the last 2 years of my PhD essentially irritating them and emailing them, and even going out to the US and giving a seminar at the NASA Ames Research Center, which allowed me to land my postdoctoral position at NASA Ames. In fact, I think my mug, yes, here is from the NASA Ames Research Center. So then I moved out there. That was in the mid-1990s, and NASA set up the NASA Astrobiology Institute. It was only then that it was really possible to think about becoming an astrobiologist. I was then offered a job at the British Antarctic Survey by David Wynne-Williams, who was setting up an astrobiology program there. So I went back and worked on microbes in Antarctica, and then I got a professorship at the Open University, which I actually didn't call astrobiology. I called myself a professor of geomicrobiology, looking at microbes in extreme rocky environments, just because at that stage of my career, I didn't really feel like I wanted to identify as a as an astrobiologist full time. I wanted to focus on something again that was quite well understood and quite well established. It was only when I came to Edinburgh that I called myself a professor of astrobiology in my early 40s. So the relevance of all of this to you who might be interested in an astrobiology degree or an astrobiology career is this: it's never too late to take an interest in astrobiology and become an astrobiologist. You don't need to go and get a degree in astrobiology. In fact, strangely enough, I would recommend you do not try and go out and get qualifications in astrobiology. A much better approach to this is to become an expert in something you can bring to the table and offer to astrobiology, to this broad subject of life in the universe. Be a biochemist who can bring that depth of experience in biochemistry. And even at much later levels in your career, like a PhD level, it's still good to have a focus, still good to have a particular area of science that you've really made a contribution to, that you can then use to contribute to this field of astrobiology. You don't even ever need to call yourself actually an astrobiologist. There are plenty of people out there who take part in astrobiology who call themselves professors of chemistry, professors of astrophysics. So in fact, you never need to get obsessed with worrying about calling yourself an astrobiologist. So for those of you who may have emailed me saying, how do I become an astrobiologist? I'm really fascinated by this field. I absolutely have to get into astrobiology, with this idea that if you don't do that, you can never be an astrobiologist. That's all completely wrong. You can involve yourself in this subject at any stage of your career. So that's the good news. So let's go back to career directions. And perhaps the best way to do this is to start at the beginning and offer advice to people at different stages of your career. So if you're worrying about getting into astrobiology and you're at primary or secondary school, here's my advice to you. I would focus on the science that interests you most. Don't get too interested or focused on astrobiology. Decide what fascinates you the most. If you're interested in biology, then do well in those exams. Take an interest in biology. If you're quite mathematically minded and you quite like physics, stick with physics and mathematics. And in the process of developing your knowledge in those areas and taking your exams, take an interest in other subjects as well. When I was at school, I was always reading popular science books on astronomy and biology. And I guess from a very young age, I was an astrobiologist of sorts, in that I had this interest in the human exploration and settlement of space. I had an interest in natural sciences. I inherited a moth collection from my grandfather that triggered my early interest in biology. So I was always reading more broadly around the subjects I eventually took. And if you do want to get into astrobiology and think about these very wide questions, life in the universe, it's good to just read things in different subject areas, even when you're at secondary school. But the most important thing at school is to get good grades. I know you've been told that by your teachers and your parents, and it's very boring to hear it again, but it is the right advice. Work hard, do well in your exams, and simply focus on the things that interest you most. Don't worry about some later endpoint. Just do well and fixate on those exams where you think you get most interest and intellectual fulfillment. In the meantime, also don't just do work, enjoy yourselves as well. So moving on, if you're someone who's emailed me and you have gone to university and you started a degree and you suddenly discovered astrobiology and you've decided you want to do this, and I often get emails from people saying, I'm doing a degree in genetics, but I want to be an astrobiologist. What do I do? And there's this like panic about it almost, that they've taken the wrong direction. Remember what I said before, it's never too late to get into astrobiology. And in fact, you're doing the right thing to get a degree in a good, focused science subject that gives you depth. And then you can get that breadth in other subjects that will allow you to contribute to scientific questions in astrobiology. So if you're doing a degree in genetics, great. Carry on doing that. Degree in astrophysics, great. Do that. But like I said for earlier stages of your career, take an interest in wider subjects. If you're doing a degree in astrophysics, it'd be really good to know something about biology. Read some popular science books about DNA, about the discovery of the genetic code. There's plenty of good popular science out there these days. If you're doing genetics or biochemistry or chemistry, learn something about astrophysics, how we hunt for exoplanets, how astrophysicists think they might look for evidence of life on exoplanets, and go out and read broadly around those subjects to give you that wider understanding of some of these subjects that connect in with the questions of astrobiology. How did life originate? How did life evolve on the Earth? Is there life elsewhere? But stick with a good scientific degree. Then you get to the end of your degree, and some people email me saying, I'm doing a PhD, or I'm thinking about doing a PhD, what should I do? Well, here's my very, very simple advice. Again, you don't need a PhD in astrobiology. In fact, there are very few PhDs in astrobiology, even now when the subject is relatively well established. And I would again advise you, in fact, not necessarily to try and find a PhD in astrobiology at all, but get a PhD in a really good focused area, in one particular area of astrobiology, whether that's astrophysics or a question in biochemistry. It is useful, whatever, to have a supervisor when you're doing a PhD who is sympathetic to these questions of astrobiology, because at that stage of your career you might want to go to a conference on astrobiology and meet other people and meet more senior people who might be able to offer you a postdoctoral position. So it's very definitely good to be in a laboratory where your supervisor has some sympathies with your interest, but also because it's good to discuss these things. At that stage of your career, when you're learning about research, it's good to sit around a lab and talk about scientific questions. That's the sort of level of scientific maturity. And if you're in a laboratory where every time you bring up the question of the origin of life or alien life, everyone looks at you and thinks you're nuts, you're not really going to have the fulfillment and opportunity to spread your scientific wings. So it's not necessary to do a PhD in astrobiology, but certainly at that stage of your career, I would advise you to try and find a PhD in a laboratory where people have a sympathy for thinking about wider questions applied to life in the universe. You can find that out easily just by asking a few questions about it during your PhD interview, and you can see how people look at you. You get a very quick idea about whether your supervisor is someone with a wide breadth of scientific interest that might welcome your particular interest in astrobiology. And beyond that, of course, you might want to look for a postdoctoral position at a university that is doing astrobiology, or a project that's more aligned with astrobiology. If you're a biologist, it might be life in extreme environments. If you're a chemist, maybe you can find a postdoctoral position looking at the origin of life. If you're an astrophysicist, maybe you can go and join a group that's looking for exoplanets. But again, even at that stage, it's not necessary to be an astrobiologist. You could be doing a postdoctoral study of life in extreme environments that has no connection with life elsewhere in the universe, but it still gives you that expertise to go on and get a permanent position. And even at the permanent position stage, as I said earlier, most people don't even call themselves astrobiologists. So it's never too late to get involved in astrobiology. It's never too late to go to conferences and take part in these discussions on scientific questions to do with astrobiology. So that's the good news for everyone who may have emailed me at different stages of their careers. You've never taken the wrong decision. You've never gone in the wrong direction. You can always get involved in this field. So the breadth of astrobiology is in some sense a little bit of its downfall in terms of establishing itself as a field, because it's so broad, people don't quite know what to do with it. But it's one of its benefits in that you can always bring in scientific expertise into this wide field of endeavor. And then finally, there are people out there who have no professional connection with science at all. I often get emails from people saying, I'm a retired banker, or I'm a retired policeman, and I'm interested in astrobiology. And that's fantastic. How do I get involved in this? And I think that's a wonderful thing to have that interest in science at any stage of your career, in whatever subject or path in life you've chosen to take. And my answer to that would be, probably you don't want to be going to scientific conferences, just because they tend to be rather specialized and quite focused on academic questions. But luckily, we live in an age where there's plenty of material online. There's a lot of very good popular science writing out there. It seems like everyone is writing popular science books these days, but that's a good thing, because it means you can always find lots of books on astrobiology. And in fact, in a future Life in the Universe pandemic series talk, I'm going to get some of the books I have in my house and make I'll give you some ideas about some of the books that I think are quite good and that you might enjoy reading as well. So outside the academic field, you can always take an interest in astrobiology. There are good television programs as well, good books, good material online. It's quite easy to find material to do with the subject. And of course, the media get quite enthusiastic. Sometimes I would say a little bit over enthusiastic at times, but there's always plenty of material online and on news channels about the search for life on Mars, exoplanets. It seems like actually they can sometimes never really get enough astrobiology. So that's a good way to keep up with the latest developments. So I hope that's useful. I hope that gives you some idea about how to become an astrobiologist. some of the directions you might take. Just to summarize, the good news is you can always get involved in astrobiology. Don't get too focused on astrobiology. Focus on the science that interests you, contribute to that, and then use that as a way to address some of these wider questions in astrobiology. Thanks a lot for joining me again. Take care, look after yourselves. Bye.